Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
Recently, a plaque was put up by the city of Salisbury to mark the 1931 lynching of Matthew Williams. But a mystery has always surrounded the identities of those who led it and participated, as a young black man was dragged from a hospital bed and lynched next to the courthouse in downtown Salisbury. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. For the first time, it appears we have some names of those who participated and perhaps organized the lynching. Charles Chavis Jr. has written a new book entitled The Silent Shore, the Lynching of Matthew Williams, and the Politcis of Racism in the Free State. It draws on documents that have not surfaced before, including from an agent with the Pinkerton Detective Agency who got firsthand accounts of that day, and we have the author on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell me then a little bit about these documents first, how you came about to uncovering them, because as I was reading your book, there's always been, of course, a story about how it happened, but the individuals who led it has always been somewhat of a mystery to me. Tell me a little bit about the kinds of documents that you found, particularly the ones from Pinkerton.
Yes, it was interesting. So I was a doctoral student at the time at Morgan State University, and I was also teaching at Anne Arundel Community College. And after reading Professor Sherlyn Eifel's book, I became intrigued about the lynchings of Matthew Williams and George Armour that took place on the Maryland's Eastern Shore. And so after reading Professor Eifel's book, I decided to double back and really look to see what exactly I was able to glean, if there's anything that she had missed, because I just felt that I just didn't really buy into this myth, this lie, if you will, that we are told historically that, lynchings take place at the hands of persons unknown. And the system of silence, or the conspiracy of silence that Professor Eiffel lays out is something that I really wanted to be able to challenge and think about, the truth. There are a lot of black people in Salisbury and throughout the country, the truth that they hold within themselves and within their community, specifically knowing the identity of individuals, but not being able to speak because of the power dynamics at play. And so I was able to go to the state archives after several attempts coming up empty. I ran into some records that had been hidden in full view, as I say in the book, for over largely 90 years. And these were investigation records, detailed investigation records of all the eyewitnesses. And so in the newspapers you'll see, using the newspapers, I was able to confirm and also track down the type of documents that I was looking for. And so in doing that, I knew that there were historically some records, specifically transcripts from eyewitnesses based on the newspaper accounts. And I looked for those, and I was able to locate all of those in the state archives, these transcripts from eyewitnesses, including law enforcement officers, chief of police, as well as state's officers, and those black and white eyewitnesses to the lynching.
Let me ask you this. Describe a little bit about what occurred here in terms of Williams and his employer, DJ Elliot. And one of the questions has always been, did Williams actually shoot DJ Elliot? And from what I've read about him in terms of his demeanor and how he related to his employer, it doesn't seem particularly plausible. How do you read it?
Well, based on the evidence and what's laid out in the book, in one of the main chapters, I look at the oral history interviews that were compiled in the NAB Center, in addition to the more recent information that I've been able to obtain. And there's two stories that are consistent throughout the region and historically. One story is that Matthew Williams, of course, killed his employer. But when looking at the oral histories from both black and white members of the Salisbury community and region, it is not seen to be so plausible. It's really unbelievable in some ways, and definitely so in the black community. And I'm able to glean from the records, specifically the will of DJ Elliot, to speculate as to the motive right, for this. But, what we also know is important and what the book reveals, we do have insight from an eyewitness who, Dr. A.D. Brown, whose story has been hidden in addition to a number of other people as well. And A.D. Brown is across the street from the incident. He witnesses this, and this is documented in his statements. He's a black physician in Salisbury, Maryland. He's actually the same physician who birthed Salisbury's own Shane Shields. And A.D. Brown talks about what he witnessed, and it's very important for us to, again, recognize that black communities, in many ways, they hid the truth to protect themselves and their families, and that's exactly what a number of black witnesses do, and I articulate that, and I lay that out in the book.
Describe for me what A.D. Brown saw.
A.D. Brown saw Matthew Williams running out of the office, and he was stumbling as if he was about to fall after he had been shot. And it was apparent that Elliot's son had shot Williams. And that is the account. There is no formal or direct evidence outside of what Elliot's son said, that he had shot his father. No one was aware of that. A.D. Brown did not witness that, and he was directly across the street. He watched everything happen. At least he saw Williams come out of the office. But there was no evidence outside of what was articulated through the state's attorney as well as others. No one saw Williams shoot anyone. That was all hearsay in many ways.
Now, I want to turn to the scene in the hospital and describe for me what that was like. You have a number of different sources, obviously inside, as well as some of the people who described it to the Pinkerton guy, and who, as you can glean, was responsible for getting him out of that hospital and dragging him out the window.
Well, the chief of police was directly involved, as were others in the city police department, as well as the sheriff as well. In that chapter, you will have play-by-play detail and account of really the thought process of some of these officials, but it becomes quite clear by the time we hear from Patsy Johnson exactly the extent to which the officers were involved. I want to be clear for your listeners and make it kind of clear as I lay out the book. So the third chapter, the chapter that focuses specifically on retelling the story, right? That chapter is based on the eyewitness accounts solely of of police officers and others. But there's two different investigations that take place, and this is very important because Albert Ritchie issued two investigations. The first investigation was a public-facing investigation that was publicly mentioned within newspapers throughout the region, throughout the state, and nationally. But he also issued a parallel secret investigation, and this is where he worked directly with Preston Lane to secure a Pinkerton detective agent who would infiltrate the mob and reveal the identities of those involved, including law enforcement, including Chief Greer, the fire chief, and others, as well as the men. One of the men who actually pours the gasoline on Williams. We have all their identities because of this Pinkerton detective agent. I discovered his journal of the 3 months that he spent in Salisbury, beginning in January to March. And it's in that chapter, in that portion of the book, where he reveals these identities and exactly the extent of the conspiracy of the system.
What specific roles then did the chief, Nicholas Holland, and then the sheriff, I guess, Philip Morris, play in this? Because they seem to be the people who, if they had decided, I think you indicate in your book, if they had decided that this was not going to happen, they very well could have stopped it. But they seem to be implementing. What were their specific roles, according to Patsy?
Yeah, well, according to Patsy, but also to the other witnesses, it became very clear through a number of interviews and a number of dialogue that we see that Patsy's having, that Chief Greer provided the rope to lynch Williams with. That is pretty clear cut. And also we have another individual who openly confesses and openly talks to Patsy and tells him that he is in fact the man who's poured the gasoline on Williams. And so what I noticed, and what's really was shocking to me as I worked through these documents, we talk about this system of silence and this conspiracy of silence, but what Patsy's able to do through his whiteness is break down this wall of silence, and really as he befriends the local community, local white community, they begin to talk openly about the lynching to him directly. And this was really shocking, but it also speaks to the nature of whiteness as well, and this whole brotherhood. And the class dynamic is something I also point out in the book as well. It became very clear to me as I worked through the research that it was in fact the muscle or the poor white laborers, in this case prize fighters, who were being used by the Salisbury elite and businessmen to do the dirty work for the lynching, which is consistent with most mob structures. You have a certain hierarchy, and that was definitely the case in Salisbury. And so you have a number of elite businessmen who, the soldiers, if you will, or the muscle, the ones who were directly involved with pulling the rope, burning Williams, etc., they always reference the big men in town who were behind it all, right? The orders that they had. And it becomes very clear, and it's referenced throughout the section on Patsy, that Holland, Murray Phillips, and others were all aware, as were a number of the hospital officials also. And so when Williams, what I noticed, it's really important, when Williams comes out, is taken out of the hospital, he's under armed police guard. And it was almost as if it was on cue that the guard left right when the mob came in. And so, it's a really tragic story, but what I want to do with this book is I want to focus on and center the truth, right? We have to be able to talk about the truth, and the community of Salisbury, the black community of Salisbury, the descendants of Matthew Williams and others deserve the truth, and all of Salisbury deserve to know the truth, specifically regarding this case and how it really directly impacts the systemic inequalities that we see to this day in the region.
Let me follow up on the business community, because I think you suggest in the book that many of them were good friends with DJ Elliot. Was that just simply that they were taking revenge then against what they thought Williams had done, obviously, for their friend? I mean, do you give me a sense about the motivation for the business community to do this, or some of the business leaders anyway to do this?
Sure. Well, I think it's important, and I lay this out in the book as well. We have to understand that, and it becomes very clear as we work through, and I read through the investigation, the statements of a number of the figures who are part of the individuals behind the lynching. What I notice is that it becomes very clear that Williams was nothing more than a tool to get back at the larger Lower Eastern Shore black community. And in fact, it's actually referenced from a number of statements as well as the investigation that Patsy, his journal investigation. In his journal, Patsy references the conversations regarding, Yule Lee had gotten away. These other individuals had gotten away. These other black men during the time had gotten away, and we had to make an example out of Williams. It was almost as if it didn't matter who he was. It didn't matter what he had done. He had to be punished, which is very consistent. And I mapped that out as well. I think one of the things that Professor Eiffel so honorably mentioned to me and others when we were doing work with the Lynching Commission. She talks about how you don't get a pass, communities should not get a pass, when they don't get the job done, right? And so we focus so much on the act of lynching. But in this book, what I want to also do, I highlight the racial terror that it dates from 1924 in the region and onward. There's a number of near lynchings that have never been documented. There's a Richard Ford who is nearly lynched in Delmarva, and others that are happening in 1929 leading up to this. And so it was almost like a perfect storm in terms of the lynching of Williams. And the more that blacks were seeking and obtaining support from organizations like the ILD and others, the more that they were seen to be a threat in terms of, especially during the economic crisis of the Great Depression. And so we can focus on Williams is very important, but I think Williams represents really the climax of the racial terror and angst of a disgruntled white community that sought to make an example out of a black man and also to put a black community as well, a black business district of Georgetown, on notice regarding surviving and also thriving during a time of economic strife.
As a matter of fact, they not just simply lynch him, but they burn him, they drag his body through the streets.
Right.
Is that something that gets planned, or is it reflective of lynchings in general? I mean, because I've read about other lynchings in which it is done to demonstrate to the African American community right up in their face, right, that
Correct.
they're doing this. And the other thing I want you to address is that something that Linda Dwyer mentioned to me is that when after all of this is over, members of the African American community then have to go back to work, perhaps in the same houses, the same homes, the same places of
Correct.
business that were owned by people who participated in the lynching.
Correct. Yeah, I mean that's correct. I mean, and that is definitely the case, and that's why this silence has persisted for so long. I mean, one of the main examples I think that is really telling is specifically the role of Levin C. Bailey, and he's the state's attorney at the time. He was involved directly in the mob, as well as in terms of orchestrating and colluding to suppress the truth regarding what happened. He was coaching witnesses. This is all documented by the Pinkerton detective agent, both Patsy Johnson and his supervisors. And this is one of the reasons why I believe that Albert Ritchie decided to have a secret investigation that went parallel, because he knew that he could not trust State's Attorney Levin C. Bailey. And Sherilyn Eiffel was the first to point this out, but Bailey also, Levin C. Bailey it's ironically the nephew of the judge who's over the case. And so these are two prominent figures, and the state's attorney at the time, Levin C. Bailey, his legacy it cannot be saved from the role that he played in this lynching. And that's something that I think is very important. And you still see these names to this day, right, in Salisbury. There's actually a firm named, in his firm is still there in Salisbury, downtown, just across the street where Williams was lynched on the courthouse lawn. But in terms of the black community, I mean, Linda's point is so important regarding the role that the power dynamics, right, what I talked about in the book as well. You know, it's very difficult for you to speak out about anything when your livelihood is directly tied to this. And that's something that I noticed in a number of the hospital statements, the statements from the hospital with the black patients who spoke, who did not speak out, who were very fearful. And, you know, their jobs were at stake in many ways. We also learned that there were blacks who spoke out. A.D. Brown is one, and then we also have the great-grandfather of Jada Pinkett Smith, Maslin Pinkett. I was able to identify Maslin Pinkett as well as A.D. Brown as two black prominent leaders who spoke out and named members of the mob directly. I was able to glean Maslin's specific contributions and him risking his life through the notes from the actual grand jury hearing from the state's attorney, from Attorney General Preston Lane, but also from a number of the agents as well, where he directly names these white leaders, some from Somerset and others from Princess Anne, who were directly behind the lynching. And so it's very important for the black community of Salisbury to recognize that, yes, deservingly so in terms of wanting to protect themselves, right? It makes so much sense to protect yourselves and your family from terror. But you also have, so the system of silence is indeed a real system. But you also have those who risked their lives to break this silence and spoke out. And what is traumatic about the hiding of this history is that it does not provide us insight into the strong, courageous black voices, such as A.D. Brown and Maslin Pinkett. And Maslin Pinkett was actually a professor at UMES, and he also was a bellhop at Wacomico Hotel as well. And so, again, these prominent black figures are here in Salisbury, and their stories have been suppressed, just like the truth behind the lynching.
So was there any repercussion for those two, or why were they able to feel as if they were able to speak out, despite the fact that there's some danger there?
Yeah, I think one of the things in terms of, both of them, it's really the protective status. I talked about this with Dr. A.D. Brown, with him being the sole black physician in the region. And it's also suggested that he had passed as well. At least Miss Shane Shields, who was alive when he was alive, talks about how he passed. And this is one of the reasons why he also was able to see the actual lynching in the mob, which is documented in the book as well. He drives through the crowd on his way out of town and witnesses the lynching. But it's really a combination of potentially passing but also protective status, which a number of historians have highlighted as well in other regions, where you have black physicians, elites, and others who are able to speak out because they have this layer of protective status. We do know that Dr. A.D. Brown was heavily connected to Baltimore, the NAACP in Baltimore, which is where he came from prior, as well as with Maslin Pinkett being connected to UMES, really a major epicenter for black educational advancement. There's a layer of protection there in many ways that they were both able to glean from. So that's one argument. But I do think it still does not diminish their bravery and what they did. But again, we would not know about this bravery if it had not been for me finding these documents, but also the work of documenting exactly what happened. And I think that's what's really tragic about this story in many ways, and what Richie finds out as he seeks to investigate this lynching. He finds out that, everyone's involved. And at the end of the day, I argue that the lynching of Matthew Williams is a state-sanctioned lynching. It's very clear-cut, because what the cover-up, as I mentioned, is quite evident, as Richie has all this information, has the people who have done it, and does nothing about it, right? And this is just makes this tragedy even more problematic. But I do think the direct correlation between this lynching and the dismantling of the Georgetown community is something that has to be reckoned with, because what part of my research argues and lays out that it was the lynching of Matthew Williams that started the direct attack and threat and plan to dismantle the entire Georgetown community.
So I want to return to Georgetown for a moment, because someone who's come here, I hadn't heard about it until maybe a few years in, from someone who actually knew Linda Dwyer. And what was interesting was that Georgetown was this sort of thriving black business community, which now, of course, has been wiped out by Route 13 and 50. Tell me a little bit about that community up until that point. I mean, because it seems as if there was some success, particularly in relationship to the fact that we, as you mentioned a moment ago, the country was going through the Great Depression.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting. I mean, so Georgetown was a black business district, nowhere near the size of that of Greenwood and Tulsa, but it represents thriving black business districts throughout. Is representative of the thriving black business districts throughout the South and other regions of the country that districts that were thriving in spite of the oppression, the segregation. We were interdependent. The black community was dependent upon each other. We were patronizing our own businesses, and we were surviving, in some cases thriving. That was definitely the case in Georgetown, and there was a legacy and a history to this. I mean, from what Linda Dwyer had documented, and what a number of other historians have documented as well, you had banks. There was a bank in Georgetown. Prior to the 30s, there was evidence of a bank. There were around 19 businesses and residences combined, right? And when we looked at 1931, right when the lynching took place, we see that there is an attempt that is made to not dismantle Georgetown the way that Greenwood was dismantled, but it's a more systemic attempt through displacement, highway advancement, and the like. And this is consistent with a consistent strategy that's used throughout the U.S. It's the case that happens with Tulsa in the 50s, and it happens through a number of other regions as well. And so it's a slow burn, as I call it. And so the same way that there's a reason why I argue that his body hung directly at the entrance of Georgetown. It was a reminder to that community for this is what happens when you get out of line. And the dismantling ensued directly thereafter, the systemic dismantling of this community.
We'll turn to the present time because obviously there are families whose descendants are descendants of some of the people who participated in these in the lynching itself. What sense do you get about how they may react? I don't know if you've talked to them or not, and how does one resolve this issue of one's descendants, I guess, doing this kind of horrible thing? And yet, we obviously, as you pointed out a moment ago, we have this sort of general silence about what happened, particularly from the white community. At least it seems to me. Perhaps not, but it just seems to me that.
Sure.
That's the case. I mean, what sense do you get, and how do you reconcile it, I guess?
Well, yeah, I think the goal indeed is not so much to reconcile. Again, my works and the work that we're doing with the Maryland Lynching Commission seeks to first promote the truth, right? And I think not only do the descendants of racial terror victims deserve the truth, but also the descendants of perpetrators and those who were complicit, they deserve to know the truth regarding their families' potential role in the lynching and murder and the racial terror that was heaped upon the black Salisbury community. And I think it speaks to really the moment that we find ourselves in. This book speaks to the moment we find ourselves in this country, where we are becoming more and more fearful of the truth, fearful of the messiness of history, right? And this book lays bare the revealed truth of this murder. It dispels this myth that lynchings took place at the hands of persons unknown. And we have an opportunity, I think the community of Salisbury has an opportunity and has definitely embraced this opportunity previously through the Lynching Commission, through the Lynching Task Force, as well as the recently established committee to investigate and discuss how we move forward, knowing this truth. Right, and so Salisbury, I think, I'm hopeful for everything I'm seeing in the community of Salisbury to be able to embrace and deal with this messiness. But we have to recognize that acknowledgement is the first step, and it is something that we all should be able to do. And, you know, I think people whose families were directly connected to this case and this lynching, they're going to react differently. Some may already have known. This may be a secret that may be in their family. Others may have no idea, right? And so I think we can't really assume or speculate as to the reactions. But moving forward, we're going to move forward in a very delicate manner with social workers and others working directly with us as we go through this process. But first and foremost, we have the blessing of the descendants of Matthew Williams, and we want to first seek truth, acknowledgement, and also justice as well.
We've been speaking with Charles Chavis Jr. He's written a new book entitled The Silent Shore, The Lynching of Matthew Williams, and the Politics of Racism in the Free State. And Charles, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me, Don. This
has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.